The discovery beneath the sands. The relentless twin suns of Proxima Centauri blazed down upon Brian Carter, scorching the surface of the desert world known as Therum 5. The crimson sands, as they were called, stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse of golden-red dust that shimmered in the oppressive heat. Brian had learned to endure many harsh climates during his years as an explorer, but nothing had prepared him for the brutal desert of Therum 5. His brown, form-fitting stealth suit was designed for temperature regulation, but it felt like a furnace as it clung to his body, its cooling system straining against the unrelenting heat. Sweat trickled down his brow and pooled in the creases of his armor. But he barely noticed. His focus was sharp, his mind on the mission. The ruins of the ancient Nixon civilization loomed ahead, half buried under centuries of sand. The crystalline spires of their once mighty city now jutted out of the sand like forgotten relics of a past that no longer mattered. The civilization had vanished long before humanity had even set foot on this planet, and with it, any traces of their technology and knowledge. Brian had come to explore those ruins, hoping to uncover something of value, a discovery that would be worth the months of grueling travel and isolation. But so far, it had been nothing but frustration. Brian kicked the sand beneath his boots, his face twisted in irritation. Another dead end, he muttered under his breath, wiping the sweat from his eyes. He had been wandering the desert for hours, scanning the ruins with his equipment, but nothing of interest had turned up. His scanner, a high-tech device capable of detecting everything from mineral deposits to unusual energy signatures, had returned only false readings. Another beep, another failure. He was beginning to lose hope that anything of significance remained hidden in the sand. As he walked past the remains of a collapsed tower, the scanner in his hand suddenly hummed to life with a more insistent beep. Brian stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. The display showed an anomalous reading, something beneath the surface, around 2 meters down. He furrowed his brow, his fingers tightening around the device. He had seen these types of readings before, but they were usually false positives, a shift in the sand, a random disturbance in the energy field. Yet this one felt different. It pulsed, almost rhythmically, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. A flicker of excitement ignited within him. This was it. He could feel it in his gut. This time, it wasn't just another glitch. He crouched down, examining the area. There were no signs of debris or disturbance that would explain the reading. No cracks in the sand, no displaced rocks. The area seemed undisturbed, a calm expanse that promised nothing. And yet, the scanner begged him to investigate further. "Might as well take a look," Brian muttered, pushing aside his doubts. He deployed his portable excavation unit, a small device capable of using focused sonic waves to break through sand, rock, and rubble. The machine whirred to life with a low hum as it began to vibrate, sending out controlled pulses that disrupted the sand in precise layers. With each wave of the sonic pulses, the sand was slowly and methodically displaced. Brian kept his eyes fixed on the scanner, his breath quickening as the anomaly grew stronger. There was something beneath the surface, something worth uncovering. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The waves of energy continued to sweep the sand away, each pulse digging deeper into the earth. Brian's muscles ached from the constant vigilance, but he refused to stop. He could feel the excitement building, and despite the harsh environment, his mind was sharp, focused solely on the task at hand. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sonic pulses ceased. The sand settled, and for a moment, everything was still. Brian squatted beside the excavation hole, wiping his face with the back of his hand. His eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of what had been uncovered. As the last grains of sand settled away, the object beneath the surface began to emerge. A large, smooth surface. Brian's heart raced. His training in archaeology and xenobiology told him that this was not just any object. This was something different. Something alive. His pulse quickened as he bent forward, brushing away the remaining sand with his gloved hands. The object that slowly revealed itself was not metallic or inanimate. It was a figure, a humanoid figure. At first, he thought it might be a statue, some ancient artifact that had been preserved through time. But as more of it emerged from the sand, his breath caught in his throat. This was no statue. A woman, her body gleaming like polished amethyst in the harsh sunlight, lay perfectly preserved in the desert sands. Her skin was an unnatural shade of violet, the color of deep twilight, and it shimmered under the sunlight as though it were made of some alien crystal. Her long, wavy black hair cascaded around her shoulders, framing her face, which was eerily serene despite the fact that she had been buried for who knew how long. Her body was clothed in a tight, form-fitting black bodysuit, its design sleek and futuristic, but also elegant. The bodysuit had thin straps, and the deep neckline suggested a civilization that prized both function and beauty. Brian's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never seen anything like this before. This was not a human. This was something entirely alien. Awakening the silent mystery, Brian knelt beside the alien figure, his breath shallow as he absorbed the unexpected discovery before him. The woman's body lay motionless, half buried in the sand, with only her face and chest exposed. Her violet skin gleamed eerily under the burning sun of Therum 5, and her long, dark hair cascaded like a river of shadows across the desert floor. There was no denying it. She was a being unlike any he had ever encountered. Everything about her screamed of another world, another species entirely, and yet here she was, preserved in the desert sands like some ancient relic. His gloved hand hovered over her form, unsure of how to proceed. His first instinct was to check for signs of life, but there were none. Her chest rose and fell with the natural rhythm of the wind, but there was no pulse beneath her skin. The lack of any heartbeat or breath was unsettling. The medical scanner, an advanced tool used to analyze alien physiology, confirmed his fears. No heartbeat, no brain activity. She was dead. The screen flickered with a dull, depressing reading that showed no signs of life, no vital signs. For a moment, Brian's mind raced. Why was she here? How had she come to be buried under the sand for what could be centuries? The desert was unforgiving, and even the toughest of beings could not withstand its merciless heat for long, not without a means of protection. This woman, whatever she was, had been here far too long, and yet there was something about her presence, an aura that made Brian hesitate. He had been in the field for years, encountering countless strange and mysterious artifacts across different planets. But this felt different. There was a connection, an unspoken bond between them, one that he couldn't explain. His curiosity, coupled with his deep respect for the unknown, urged him to do more than just walk away. Brian reached for his backpack, unzipping the compartment where he kept his emergency medical supplies. There, nestled between various tools and vials, was a small, sleek syringe with a biocompound known to stimulate rapid biological response. It was a last-ditch effort, something that could potentially bring a humanoid being back from the brink of death. He had heard stories of alien species who could survive in states of suspended animation, but he had never tried using the compound himself. He wasn't sure it would even work. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the syringe, studying it for a moment before shaking his head. "What have I got to lose?" he muttered to himself. He was alone out here, the scorching desert winds howling in the distance. No one would ever know if he didn't take a chance. He positioned himself carefully, kneeling beside her, and injected the compound into her chest. For several seconds, nothing happened. Brian felt his heartbeat speed up in anticipation as he leaned in closer. There was no visible reaction, no sign that she was responding. Then, just as he was about to give up hope, the faintest flutter passed through her body. Her chest rose slightly, and a soft, shaky breath escaped her lips. A jolt of electricity surged through Brian's veins, his heart racing as he watched the alien woman's body stir. For a few long moments, she lay still, and just when he thought he might have failed, her back arched, and her eyes shot open. Deep indigo eyes, darker than the void of space itself, locked onto his. She gasped, taking in her first breath, in what seemed like an eternity, her body trembling violently as the rush of life returned to her. Brian instinctively moved to steady her, his arms supporting her as she sat up, her body still unsteady. "Easy there," he said, his voice calm, yet filled with astonishment. "Take it slow. You're safe now." She blinked rapidly, her gaze shifting as though struggling to understand where she was and what had happened. Her hands reached out, trembling as she placed them on the sand, trying to steady herself. The shock of her sudden awakening seemed to leave her confused and disoriented, but as her eyes focused on him, a flicker of recognition passed through her expression. "You brought me back." Her voice was soft, melodic, but faint. It was clear she had not spoken in a long time, her voice rough from disuse. Brian chuckled softly, still in disbelief over what he had just witnessed. "Yeah," he replied with a wry grin. "Guilty as charged. But how exactly did you end up buried in a desert ruin, if you don't mind me asking?" The woman's eyes flickered as though she were searching for the words, her mind still reeling from her revival. Her breathing was still shallow, but it seemed to stabilize with each passing second. She pushed herself up slowly, her body weak from the long period of suspended animation. The elegant black bodysuit she wore clung to her form, and Brian noted the faint symbols etched into the fabric, something he hadn't seen before. Her hands clenched the sand beneath her, as though to ground herself in the moment. "I don't remember," she said after a moment, her voice tinged with confusion. "The last thing I remember was running. Running from something. I thought I was escaping. But the storm, it was too powerful. I tried to take shelter here, but..." Her words trailed off as she looked around, taking in the vast, empty desert stretching in every direction. Brian's brow furrowed as he listened, piecing together her fragmented recollection. "Storm. You were running from something. What kind of storm?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes flicking to the horizon, where the golden sands seemed to stretch endlessly. "The Crimson Syndicate," she whispered hoarsely. "They're enforcers. They were after me. I had to run. I thought I'd found safety here, but the sandstorm buried me. I didn't expect to survive." The mention of the Crimson Syndicate caught Brian's attention. He had heard of them. Ruthless criminals known across the galaxy for their brutal methods and unyielding pursuit of their targets. They were not a group to be trifled with. "Crimson Syndicate, huh?" Brian muttered under his breath, a mixture of disbelief and admiration in his voice. "Sounds like you've had a rough time." She nodded weakly, her indigo eyes staring at him as though trying to assess his intentions. "I've been running for so long, I didn't know if I'd make it." Her voice trailed off, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to Brian. "Well, you made it," Brian said with a reassuring smile. He helped her to her feet, noting how fragile she seemed, though she was clearly regaining strength. "And you're not running anymore. I've got a ship nearby. We'll get you somewhere safe." As they moved toward the outskirts of the ruins, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. Brian's mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? What had she been running from? And how was it possible for her to survive, buried for so long in the merciless sands? He helped her along, making sure she stayed steady on her feet as they moved through the shifting sands. The desert was still a dangerous place, but for now, they were together, and he was determined to get her to safety. There would be time for questions later. The secret she carries. The harsh wind of the desert whipped across the horizon, kicking up small whirlwinds of sand as Brian helped Sarah walk toward the Stellar Wanderer, his ship. The fading light of the twin suns painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, but the air still hung heavy with the promise of the heat to come. Brian adjusted his grip around her waist, noting how the warmth of her body slowly returned as she leaned on him for support. Sarah was still weak, her limbs stiff from her long period of suspended animation, and she kept her head low, clearly overwhelmed. Her eyes darted around nervously, as if every new sound or movement in the distance reminded her of the chaos she had fled. But despite the confusion that clung to her like a second skin, there was something about her presence that drew Brian in. It wasn't just her otherworldly appearance, her violet skin, her sharp indigo eyes. It was the quiet strength in her, the unspoken depth of her past, that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. She was a survivor, and yet she looked lost, like a wanderer who had long since given up hope. As they approached the stellar wanderer, its sleek, silver frame cutting through the evening's dusk, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't a mere coincidence. There was something about Sarah, something about the way she had come to life again under his touch, that felt like destiny. But Brian didn't believe in destiny. He believed in the choices you made, the paths you forged through action. Still, this felt different. She was no ordinary being, and whatever brought her to Therum 5 wasn't by chance. "Here we are," Brian said as he gently guided her toward the ramp of his ship. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, welcoming them into the cool, metallic interior. The hum of the ship's life support systems kicked on immediately, providing the kind of climate control that only advanced human engineering could offer. Sarah winced slightly at the shift in temperature as they entered, her body shuddering from the cooler air. Brian quickly guided her to one of the ship's benches, where she sat down, her eyes scanning the room with intense curiosity. The ship was relatively simple, designed more for function than flair, but it had everything a traveler could need: medical supplies, communication equipment, and a small kitchen unit that Brian used to prepare meals on the go. "You look like you could use some rest," Brian said, taking the seat across from her. His fingers ran through his tousled hair as he studied her, still processing what had just happened. "I'll get you some food and water. You've been through a lot." Sarah gave him a grateful but wary look, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still weak. I don't remember much of anything. It's all fragmented." Brian went to the small kitchen, rummaging through supplies, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had many questions about her past, and about why she had ended up in such a dire situation. But he knew better than to bombard her with them all at once. She needed time to recover, time to piece together her own story. But there was one question that had been on his mind ever since he had first laid eyes on her, something that gnawed at him. How had she survived so long beneath the sand, seemingly untouched by the ravages of time? When Brian returned with a flask of water and a protein pack, he sat down across from Sarah once again. He handed her the water, and she took a long sip, her hands still trembling slightly. As she drank, Brian studied her with an intensity he hadn't expected. There was something in her gaze, those deep indigo eyes, that held a mystery, a promise of answers that could change everything. Finally, he broke the silence. "Sarah, I have to ask, how is it that you were buried beneath the sands for so long? Your body, was perfectly preserved. No decay, no signs of aging. That's not normal, not even for the most advanced species. How did you survive?" Sarah lowered the flask, her hands gripping it tightly, her knuckles white as she pondered his question. Her lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but then she paused. She closed her eyes, collecting her thoughts, before looking up at him, her gaze steady and piercing. "It's not as simple as it seems," she began, her voice low, almost reluctant. "I come from a distant planet, one far beyond the reach of your kind. My people, they're not like humans. We have abilities, technologies that can preserve life in ways you would not believe. My species, the Virelan, are known for our connection to the energy fields of the universe. We can manipulate the forces of nature to heal, to protect, and yes, to survive." Brian's curiosity deepened, but he kept his questions in check, not wanting to interrupt her as she continued. He had heard of species that could manipulate energy in various ways, but he had never encountered one quite like this. His hand subconsciously reached for the scanner in his pocket, but he kept it still, knowing now wasn't the time for any more invasive technology. During my travels, Sarah continued, her voice growing distant, I became entangled in a conflict, one that forced me to leave my home behind. The syndicate I told you about, they're not just criminals. They have ties to ancient, intergalactic organizations. They hunt people like me, people with abilities. The storm, the sandstorm I mentioned, wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was engineered. Brian leaned forward, his interest piqued. Engineered. How? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as though remembering the pain of those events. The syndicate used a weapon, something that could disrupt the energy field around me. It left me vulnerable. It severed my connection to the forces that protected me. I was left, exposed. I ran as far as I could, and when the storm came, I thought I had found shelter. But I was wrong. The last thing I remember is collapsing, the sand engulfing me as I tried to stay conscious. And then, nothing. Brian's mind raced as he processed her words. The syndicate, a group of powerful and dangerous individuals, had been hunting her. And they had nearly succeeded. But something about her story seemed off. If she had this energy-based ability to protect herself, how had she ended up so vulnerable? There were still pieces of the puzzle missing, and Brian was determined to find them. So this energy field, he said cautiously, is that what kept you alive? The connection to this force you mentioned. Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Yes, but it's not just about surviving. It's about balance. My people were once the stewards of that balance, protectors of our universe's delicate energies. But the syndicate's interference shattered that. The disruption took me to the edge of death. And then, you brought me back. Brian felt a surge of empathy for her, but there was also a profound sense of awe. He had no idea how this strange woman had come to be caught in such a perilous situation, but he felt an inexplicable connection to her. It was as if fate had thrown them together, and now it was up to him to help her, to see her story through. He leaned back in his chair, allowing the silence to settle between them as the ship's engines hummed softly. He knew that whatever was coming next would not be easy, but one thing was clear. Sarah's journey, and his own, were far from over. The answers she held could change everything, for both of them. Rest for now, Brian said softly, trying to keep the weight of their situation from overwhelming her. We'll figure this out. We'll find out what's really going on, together. Sarah nodded, her body finally starting to relax as she closed her eyes. Brian watched her, knowing that the journey ahead would be anything but ordinary. And somewhere, in the vast, silent reaches of space, an ancient power stirred. The story of Sarah and the mysteries of her world were just beginning to unfold.